Andrew, thanks again for giving us your time to talk through these church planner questions. We've got one now, and I suspect this person is feeling a bit under the gun with all the sorts of things they've got to do, because their question is, how do you run your church service and do evangelism in your public meeting? Or is it one, or is it the other, or are they somehow work together? So evangelism versus public meeting.
Yeah. Look, we've got to do missional work. We've got to get out there and meet people where they're at and connect with them and so on. The olden days of church at the centre of the suburb, everyone coming to you, everyone acknowledges that kind of Christendom's done, absolutely. But I think we can overreact against the concept of attractional ministry. Church does still have a place in mission, quite a powerful place, as long as I reckon you keep a couple of things in place. The first peg for us is that theologically, biblically, church is not for evangelism. The theology of church is that it's the gathering of God's people around His Word to bring Him honour and praise as we express the victory of Christ on the cross to have won us to oneness in Him, to gather us. So that's what church is for. It's for the gathering in and of itself. Therefore, it's for believers. But of course, as is often noted, 1 Corinthians 14 has that wonderful little expression that if the idiotes is among you, if the outsider comes, then some of the things that you do in church will have a positive or negative impact on him, and you need to bear that in mind. And so we've never gone the seeker service, because inevitably the seeker service model, not only does it go against the scriptural theological principle for church, it dumbs down the temperature, the spiritual temperature for Christians in church, and in the long term kills the very people who are going to do your evangelism. And so short term it can work, long term it kills you. Church is for raising the spiritual temperature of believers. It's to fire their hearts for Christ. And here's the thing that actually helps me in all of this. Getting that theology in place, that's what church is for, that's what it's about. It's not for the outsider, it's for the believer to be fired up. The thing that helps me is, how do you raise the spiritual temperature for believers? By preaching the gospel. So when you understand the gospel, that's actually what you're doing in church every week.
Andrew, I guess some of the things we've been talking about so far really relate to what's being said from the pulpit, but there is a whole service. How does that relate to the believer, unbeliever distinction?
Yeah. Good question, thank you. What we're also trying to do is constantly shaped by the priority that it's the primacy of church is for the believer, but aware that we need to give allowance for the idiotes who might be there, and we want to encourage that to happen more and more. So we do, we work hard at cutting out most of the jargon, not all of the jargon. I think it becomes quite anemic if you've got no jargon. We work hard at using language that is aware of the unbeliever there, such as, for instance, we tend not to talk about the non-Christian in our public services. We will sometimes, but we talk about the person who might be here who's not a believer, who doesn't yet follow Christ. We try and use other language that's not so negative and condemnatory. The illustration for mine is the homosexual one, in that we ought never preach sermons in a public setting about homosexuality as if there's no homosexuals there. About the homosexual out there. We will expect in a reasonably large gathering to have people who don't know Christ, and we talk as if they're there listening in on our conversations. So there are things we take care. We don't sing as much as we might if we were on our own, just believers altogether. We're a little bit conscious of the outsider and how they might be kind of alienated by that experience if it went too long.
Does that affect to the way you would handle, I guess, prayer is another one? I mean, because you've got that differences of you're conscious of that differences of relationship in the room. Does it affect the way that prayer is presented?
Yeah, look, we do talk to our prayers about the need to be aware that as they pray the gospel, so that the prayer for the needs of our local congregation are important and appropriate, but they need to be done in a context of how, even in that, can I communicate the love of God for me in Christ by grace alone, faith alone, and so on. So we're always trying to speak of even the normal experiences that are constantly flushed through with the gospel, so that everything kind of builds this communication process to people who are there. And it's quite, it's possible to do. It's readily available to do. Yeah.
So, Andrew, the gospel is more than just two ways to live?
Yeah, well, it is two ways to live. The gospel can be said, Christ is Lord. There's the gospel, but that's in its most distilled form. Whereas when you understand that in its most distilled form, you see actually truly that the whole Bible, every chapter of it, is speaking of the gospel. And so every expository sermon, every chapter that we work through in the scriptures is a point at which you preach the gospel. You preach Christ, you declare the need to repent and turn and come free from a world that's in darkness and death. And so all the time we're looking to preach the gospel to stir the hearts of believers, but aware that that very same gospel will impact those who don't know Christ among us. Now, we kind of call this, in our context here anyway, we call this worldview preaching, to try and give it some sense that it's not merely commentary style, here's a verse, what does it say, here's a verse, what does it say, here's the syntax and grammar. We want to actually see the message of that chapter or that chunk that we're working through. What is its appeal to us? What's God calling on us to from this section, so that we've understood the mechanics and how it works to get the appeal, and in a way that actually challenges our way of seeing life. The whole big picture of life is challenged by the very gospel that's declared week by week. And so therefore that work will do both ends. It will always stir the believer but impact the unbeliever. Now we do deliberately reference the fact that there will be those who don't know Jesus amongst us. We're very conscious of that, and so on occasion we do that kind of, if you're someone who follows Jesus, here's the application. If you're someone who doesn't yet know Jesus and are wrestling with these things, we'll do that there. Primarily gospel to believers, but gospel to believers in a way that impacts always the outsider.
And I take it, so what you're saying is that in the process of it being explicit about the gospel for believers, you're creating that distinction which you believe that non-believers will pick up on, that there's that salt, that light comes out as the more and more as they understand it, rather than an explicit altar call or anything like that.
Yeah. We would only do altar calls 4 or 5 times a year, maybe. No, I'm actually saying a little bit more than I'm actually saying. When I'm sorry for the noise. That's
okay. We've got builders, have we?
When we expound a text of the Bible, now it's hard to illustrate this because at the moment we're going through John's Gospel, and I've just been preaching on the resurrection for the last 2 weeks, and so that's pretty directly to non-Christians as well. Yeah. But say you did Ephesians chapter 1. Again, this is a fairly obvious text, but there's a message about God's grand purposes for the world, which is to stir the believer to see that they're part of something magnificent. But there's a worldview that's to capture them and challenge the unbeliever. Here's God's purposes for the world. You're missing out. Where are you in the reason for existence? So that preaching that kind of doesn't just give me the practicalities of what to do as a Christian, but stirs my whole worldview and framework of thinking. It's our conviction that that's how you stir the believer and impact the unbeliever.
Well, you made a point.
I might say too, around the preaching, it's the whole package of church as well. So it's worth unpacking that, of course, too. Yeah.
Well, listen, let me sort of see if I can tag this person's question a bit closer to what we're talking about. So, if the public meeting, so to speak, the church meeting is not the place where you're really going to be doing evangelism, what would you say is the preferred context? I mean, there is obviously going to be some form of of public interaction, it's not all personal one-to-one, what would you say is the appropriate place to do that?
Yeah. Our conception is that the public assembly sets the scene. It provides the platform or the umbrella for the whole work, because it really does set the spiritual temperature for church life. And we are seeing many people come along and find their lives being changed and wanting their friends to share in that and bring their friends along. Where we do more of, in our context at least, where we do more of the, here is exactly the nature of the cross, the resurrection, how to respond, what the nature of sin is every time. We do that in a separate context. We've set up a series of courses that run now 8 times a year. And so people in our church know when they're coming, they're inviting their friends to those programs with a view to either coming to church and getting invited into it, or a separate invitation. And out of that, they then move into follow-up groups and then back into the church context as well.
Which is where the growing with the gospel takes place.
Yeah. But what we find is we get both ends. We get people converted week by week. So 2 weeks ago, 20-something girl was converted at night church just through having been brought for months into church. But we've also had 20 conversions through life to the full in the last 2 months.
Yeah, it's somewhat annoying, God not working to a particular pattern. It makes it very hard to plan. Look,
which means you plan for lots of pipelines.
Yeah.
So you've got to begin where you begin. When the resources are small, you set in place a limited area, but you do work towards not just a simple one-dimensional strategy. You build a bunch of them together, recognising exactly that point. People are different. God works differently in everyone's lives, through the gospel always. But
mate, thanks very much for giving us your wisdom on that one. And I'll just say to anybody who has a question that they'd like to ask Andrew, try and plumb the depths. Look, we're doing deep theology, it seems, over the last couple of questions. So if you feel like passing one on to Andrew and seeing what he has to say, just email through to the address that's coming up on your screen now, and we'll pass it on to Andrew. Thanks, mate.
Pleasure.